Hey, fourth grade. Well, we're going to jump back into action and do some new math today. So, yet again, just like in my other videos, let's say your mom or your dad walks in and they're like, hey, what are you doing in math today? Well, you can always look down here at the bottom because, again, like in my other math videos, our I can statement is always down here at the bottom. So today it says, Lesson 1. Use metric measurement to model the decomposition of one whole into tenths. And if you remember, I always encourage you to look at the math that's on the problem set, and I want you to think, what do I know? What are some strategies, even though this is new, what are some strategies that I've previously learned to think about my math for today? So if I take a peek, well, I'm always going to want to write my name on my paper. It's still good practice, so just put your name on your paper. But when I look at this, I'm thinking, well, I know we've talked a little bit about the metric system, and I remember that that is a unit of measurement. So I look right here, and that looks like soda. So it says 1L, so that really stands for 1 liter. And if you remember, some of you fourth graders have actually talked about the metric system and converting the metric system on some of your Zern lessons. Then if I look down here, well, I see this kg. Well, if you remember, that would stand for kilograms. So that's kind of interesting. All right, then I'm going to peek to the back because there is two sides to this. And then it's asking me, let's see, cm? Well, that's what I see on my ruler, and that stands for centimeters. Then it has this matching activity down here at the very bottom. And this is kind of interesting because when I look at this, I think, well, we've actually talked about some of this before in class. So I see 3/10. And you know that sometimes in our problem sets, they really do give you the math in English words. And so when I read this, 3/10. Here's one of the reasons why I always say, if it says it in English words, go ahead and write out what you hear in a number. So 3/10. And then it says, match each amount, and I am doing the last part first, so bear with me on that. Match each amount expressed in unit form to its equivalent fraction, and we have talked about equivalent fractions, and decimal form. So the decimal form is what's new for us in math for right now. So a decimal, if you remember, is what some people are calling that tiny little dot. So then when I look at this column, I see 0.2, okay? Well, sometimes people read this as 0 and, so the decimal becomes the English word and, 0 and 2/10. Then I would come down here and I would read this one, 0 and 6/10. 0 and 3/10. 0 and 5/10. 0 and 9/10. And I know you're saying, tenths. Well, we've talked about that in fractions. So if we say tenths, well, that means make sure you can see this, my denominator is going to be a 10, tenths, right? And we have spent weeks on talking about different types of ways that you're going to be able to see the kind of math when we talk about fractions. So equivalent fractions in decimal form. So I have my scratch paper here really quick because remember when you do your math, you're probably going to want scratch paper too. So if you remember, we have actually talked about decimals. Not a ton, but we have. So we've talked about 1/2. And then we've said, well, what would 1/2 be in a decimal? So if you think about, and I'm going to draw a tape diagram. So if I have a chocolate bar and it's cut in half and I have all of this, well, I have 1/2. Or I could also say I have 50%. So if you think about this in terms of money, well, what would half of a dollar be? It would be 50 cents. So how would I write 50 cents with the decimal? Well, it would look like this, 50 cents, okay? So now we're thinking about equivalent fractions and their cousin, the decimal. So let's see, 2/4. Okay, so I could draw a tape diagram. Well, if you look at it, it's still half. And then I could say this is equivalent to 1/2 or 5/10, okay? Another way of looking at this, and sometimes you guys have asked me about this too, is thinking about grades. So we've talked about when you get a little bit older, you're going to get letter grades. And we talked about, let's say, if there were 10 questions on a quiz and you get 10 out of 10 questions, well, that would be 100%. Or we could say you got 10 out of 10. It literally is just thinking of it in a different way, but it's the same thing. So if you took a quiz and you only got 9 out of 10, well, that would be the equivalent of 9/10. Now here's where this gets tricky, because if we were in our classroom, I would show you the picture that is on our whiteboard, and it has the place value. And if you remember, the place value looks like this. So we have the ones place, and then we have the tens place, and then we have the hundreds place, and then we have the thousands place. So if you remember, each time I move to the left, well, that's getting 10 times bigger. Okay? Well, I could keep going, and I could go all the way to the millions place, and hopefully you remember that. But now we're looking at going to the right. So I'm going to change colors here. Okay? So right here is where I would put the decimal, or you see that adorable purple dot. Okay? So now I want you to think, well, what is directly one spot to the right of the ones place? Well, that's the tenths place. Okay? Another way of saying that is 1/10. So think of this as a dime. And if you think about the way we would write a dime, it would look like that. Maybe you might even see it with a 0 here. And I can continue to put zeros here. That still only means 1/10. Okay? So then you got to think, well, if going to the left is 10 times greater, then believe it or not, moving to the right is dividing by 10. Okay? So then if I move over once more to the right, well, that's going to be this. And if you jump back to your first grade, maybe second grade, kindergarten years, well, if I was telling you I had this much in my pocket right now, well, how much would I have? So if this is 10 cents, then this must be a penny. It's not worth a lot. But hey, sometimes people say pennies bring you good luck. So if I see one, I'm still going to pick it up. All right, so this would be, are you ready? 1/100th. okay? 1/100th. So if I was to put that in its fraction form, I would say it's in the hundredths place. So this is a hundredths place. This is the hundredths place. It's like you got to take that tongue and stick it out to make that TH. The hundredths place, okay? So you have the tenths place. Move over to the right. The hundredths place. Move over to the right again. Well, that's going to be the thousandths place. So thousandths. Thousandths. So do you see that little TH? So these words are actually different than the words you would see over on this side, okay? So each time I move once to the right, well, my numbers are going to become smaller in value. And if you take a look over here, well, if I go from the tens place to the ones place, well, how do I go from a 10 to a 1? I have to divide by 10. So 10 divided by 10 is going to get me 1. So another way of thinking of that is 10 divided by 10. Well, what would be my answer? 1. All right, so let me go back to our problem set. So it's saying 3/10. Remember to always read the directions. Sometimes people jump in and they try and do the math, but they don't actually read the directions, and that always causes them problems. All right, 3/10 match each amount expressed in unit form to its equivalent fraction and decimal form. So 3/10 is the same as 3/10. And now I've got to find it in its decimal form. So if you remember at the very beginning of the year, we spent a lot of time practicing our place value. So now you've got to think what would be actually smaller than 1. Now, in our last chapter, we talked about fractions. In this chapter, we're going to talk about numbers that are still smaller than 1, only in decimal form. So if 1 was right here, then this is going to be your, let's say, this is 1 right here. I was going to do a number line, but let's not. Let's just go ahead and put them in these boxes. If this is your ones place, well, then this would be your tens place, and this would be your hundreds place. So if I move to my right, well, this would be my tenths place. This would be my hundredths place. This would be my thousandths place. And then I could keep going. But since you're in the 4th grade, I'm going to stop right here. Okay? So 3/10. Well, if you look right here, that 3 is on top of a 10. So I know that my place value, 0, is going to be right here. Because if you think about 3/10, I do not have a whole. I only have 3 out of a 10-piece chocolate bar. And then my 3 is going to go right here in the 10th place. If I move over, that would be the hundredths place. Okay? So when I continue to move to the right on my place value chart, my numbers and my value, the value of my numbers is going to get smaller. And if you take a look at my place value chart, well, if I start in my thousands place and I move over to the right, well, it is going to get smaller. It's going to be divided by 10. So if I have a number in my hundreds place and I divide it by 10, it's going to be in the tens place, okay? So if you think about the math on that, you ready? If you have, let's say, 5,000 and you divide it by 10, well, what would be your quotient? It would be, are you ready? This pause is because I want you to be thinking. Ready? What would it be? Yeah, 500. Okay? And if you think back to all of the work that we've been doing throughout the year, well, double check. 500 times 10 equals 5,000. Okay? So you always want to go back and double check. All right. So thinking about the equivalent fraction, but also the decimal form. So think about this in terms of a quiz you might take when you're older. If you get 9/10, well, that would be 9 out of 10 questions correct. So what would your score be? Okay, let's flip back to this top part. So this looks just like a number line that we were doing in our fractions unit. So if you see here, we're starting at 0, we're ending at 1. So that means all of these numbers, oh, there you go, there's my 1. All of these numbers here in the middle are going to be bigger than 0, but smaller than 1, okay? So they're going to be bigger than 0, smaller than 1. Okay? And then they give you the first answer. So it's a number line essentially. Shade the first 7 units on the tape diagram. Count by tenths to label the number line using a fraction and a decimal for each point. Circle the decimal that represents the shaded part. Okay, so here's where you're going to have to really be a clue detective. Let's see. They want you to shade in the first 7 units. They want you to count by tenths. So I know that my fraction is going to have a denominator of 10. And then they want me to put the decimals here. So always look at the example they're going to give you, okay? So I know that I'm going to need a fraction on all of these. I also know I'm counting by tenths. So on every single fraction, my denominator is going to be a 10. Okay? And then they did the first one for you. So if this is 1, what would this be? So I'm skipping a few. I'm going to come all the way over here. Well, what would this one be? Now remember, you're saying it's equivalent to 1, so it would have to be 10/10. Okay? Well, 10/10 would be 1, just like in our fractions unit. Okay? So if I go back here and plug in my decimal, well, I'm going to read this as 4/10. So I'm going to think back to my place value. Let's see. If this is the ones place, this is going to be the tenths place. And then I'm going to move over. This is going to be the hundredths place. It would look like this in decimal form. I'm going to use a different color. Okay? So if you see my pattern in my decimals, so if this is my pattern, what would be the next one? So my decimal is going to look like this. Okay? All right. So on the next one, write the, now remember, I didn't do all the work up here. That still needs to be done by you. Okay. Number 2, write the total amount of water in fraction form and in decimal form. So they want you to have it in a fraction form. They also want you to have it in a decimal form. Fraction form, decimal form. Okay. Now remember, this would be the tenths place, and this would be the hundredths place. All right, so now I've got to look and read how much soda is in this liter bottle. It looks like the line is right here. Okay? Now they're telling you this is 1 whole liter. This right here is where the soda is. Right here is 5/10 of a liter. So I have to count the little notches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, good. That makes sense. So if right here is 5/10, then right here is going to be 6/10. Well, what would the decimal form be? So I always think of the 0 here. 0 and 6/10. Okay? Well, if right here is 5/10, up here is a full liter, what would this measure to be? Remember, you can start right here, or you can start right here. Doesn't matter, you still have to count up. Okay, so what would your fraction be? I'll give you a tiny little hint. This is going to be your denominator. All right, right here, they're actually telling you where to draw your own line. So think of this as, well, here is my ones place. Here is my tenths place. All right, same thing over here. It looks like they're wanting you to write your fraction or decimal form, because right here they give you decimal form, but right here they give you a fraction. Right here they're asking you to figure it out. So here's 0 kilograms, here's 5/10 kilograms. Well, when you read these little notches, what does it say? Okay. All right. Let's go back to this page we were already looking at. Oop, upside down. All right, so right here, they're kind of giving you a reference to a ruler. And if you remember, I've already talked about how this is a ruler too. So they're asking you to think about centimeters. Write the length of the bug in centimeters. And they've kind of pretended to blow it up, right? With the magnifying glass. And right here, if I read this correctly, it says centimeters. So they're asking you, where does that bug measure? To me, I would look right here. So it's not 0 centimeters. It's also, the bug is also not a full centimeter. So what would the fraction form be? Okay. What would the decimal form be? Hint, your denominator is going to be 10. All right. Now, if you look at this middle section, it says, fill in the blank to make the sentence true in both fraction form and decimal form. Okay? So they're asking you, if you have 8/10 and you of a centimeter and you need a whole, well, how many more would you need? So 8, I always count up 9, 10. So I would need 2/10 more to make a whole centimeter. Okay? Over here, well, they're kind of pushing you out of your comfort zone because now this is a decimal. So you kind of have to think, what place is that 8 in? Okay, go back to your place value. Today, this lesson is pushing you out of your comfort zone. You're looking at numbers that are smaller than 1. We did that for a whole unit. We call those numbers fractions. A number smaller than 1, fractions. But fractions also have a cousin called decimals. Decimal form, okay? So think of it this way. If you get 5 out of 10 questions right on a quiz, that would be 5/10 or 50%. That would be a good grade. Okay, let's say you get 9 out of 10 questions correct on a quiz. Well, that would be 9/10. Now remember, I don't make this stuff up. This is because the 9 happens to be sitting on top of a 10. That means it's in the 10ths place. And if I go back to my place value chart, well, this is always going to be the 10ths place. This is always going to be the 100ths place. Did you hear that TH at the end of those words? This is always going to be the thousandths place. Did you hear that TH at the end of that word? Makes me feel like when you're a little kid and you learn about the TH sounds and the clowns, oh, I just hit the camera, and the clowns are saying that you can stick your tongue out a little bit at the teacher, which I think is hilarious. All right, let's go back up. So if you have 8/10, well, 8/10 would be 8/10. Okay, so how many more would you need to get to a whole centimeter? Well, believe it or not, it would look like that. All right, 4th grade, take a deep breath. You can do this. Decimal form is the cousin of fraction form. Okay, let's practice a few more. Ready? So 1/10 would look like this. Can you see that? All right. 2/10 would look like this. 3/10 would look like this. 4/10, what would that look like? 5/10, what would that look like? 6/10, what would that look like in decimal form? Okay, and if I get all the way over here, 10/10, well, that's a whole. And if you remember from our fraction unit, that's what we do. If let's say you got 10 extra credit points, well, that would be 2. All right, 4th grade, here we go. Here's a perfect opportunity to be comfortable with being uncomfortable with something new. Dive in and save the day, 4th grade.